Sometimes an image comes along and the clothing tells such a provocative story that you simply must know more. Such was the feeling the first time I clicked on the trailer for the upcoming film Poor Things and saw the frilly, fabulously ridiculous clothing worn by the main character, Bella Baxter. Poof up you, sleeves. To be clear, I haven't actually seen the full movie. As of right now, it hasn't been released. But I have read the book the movie is based on, and I've read every review and interview I can find, and the intrigue has not worn off. Looks like we're doing this. I will give a slight content warning. Based on the book and the reviews, this film is definitely of an adult nature and features full nudity and a lot of sexual content. This video obviously does not contain anything graphic, and no spoilers past what is evident in trailers. The story takes place in a fictionalized 1890s-esque fantasy version of Europe and other locations. Bella, the main character, is the experiment of her guardian, Dr. Godwin Baxter, and has the mind of an infant in the body of a grown woman. The story progression sees her naively brush past the men in her life's attempts to infantilize and control her as she discovers her own sexuality and sense of self. The costumes are an extremely important part of the story, and obviously, this story. I am extremely interested in the way we use clothing to convey narrative, emotion, identity, but also how the story influences our understanding of clothing. For instance, most people only experience the history of fashion through a literal camera lens, so whatever story that fashion is part of becomes a part of their understanding of the fashion. Every scrap of clothing Bella wears in all of the previews is absolutely phenomenal. From the infant-like nightie she wears in the opening shots of the trailer, to the cagey lobster tail bustle, to the prophylactic coat, which is actually coated in silicone, I guess. But the image that made me say, I must investigate further, was this one. Probably because in the context of the other images, it automatically made me, who hasn't seen the movie, register a character arc. Every other piece Bella wears is girly, light, airy, but this piece has a touch of the masculine. To quote costume designer Holly Waddington, everything comes from a historical source. I just haven't been slavish in the use of materials or the way things are worn. Casual use of an extremely triggering word aside, where do I sign up? This coat was apparently based on an extant coat, minus some trimming. I don't know what coat it was based on, but I can say that it is remarkably similar to coats of the late 19th century. Bella wears hers with no skirt because that's Bella and that's her story. As for me and my story, I'm motivated by the how, the why, the what if of clothing. How would these coats have been made historically? What did they mean to that culture? Why is this style still meaningful to us now? What does it mean to us now? What if we could bring that quality and meaning into our modern narrative? Anyway, I'm making this coat using historical methods, but making it for my 21st century self. Enjoy. I found this pattern in this book, and even though this book is about 20 years later than the period I'm looking at for the coat, it seemed pretty plausible as a starting off point. Drafting schmafting, I photographed the diagram, blew it up to match my waist measurement, tile printed it, and taped it together. I held it up to my body, said, close enough for mock-ups, and was stuck in mock-up purgatory for about a week. The problem was I didn't see any shaping in Bella's coat, so I was determined that my coat didn't need any shaping. I finally realized this is not a cosplay, I couldn't give a fig less about screen accuracy, so this is what I ended up with, pattern-wise. The lining for the coat was essentially the body and sleeve pieces minus the facings. I used a lovely black wool coating fabric for this, which is fantastic in theory, until it comes time to do anything with the entire yardage. I obviously won't be washing this wool coat in a washer, but I'll definitely be steaming it. So I began by spraying and steaming the entire yardage, which not only makes it nice and flat, but also pre-shrinks the wool. At least I found a use for my antique Singer's flywheel, until I finally put it back together anyway. I marked the darts in chalk. The undercollar was cut on the bias and therefore had a center back seam. I sewed this by hand because my machine was getting a much needed upgrade at the time. You want to press thick coating fabric like this well, using steam and a wooden clapper, which quickly soaks up the steam to leave a crisp, permanent press. I sprayed and steamed the horsehair tailor's canvas I used, just in case there was any shrinkage, and cut corresponding pieces to the undercollar. This was my first mistake. I shouldn't have sewn the center back seam like this. I should have lapped it, since the canvas is so springy. Not the end of the world, I just felled down the seam allowance to keep it flat. I matched this up to the undercollar and pad stitched. And here's my second mistake. Give me a minute and I'll fix it. Closer. There we go. Because pad stitching gives 3D shaping to the piece, the direction of the pad stitching really makes a difference with how the collar will eventually lay. I steamed the undercollar into place using my tailor's ham as a form and set it aside. I used the canvas with the horsehair laying horizontally to give structure to the front of the coat. As you can likely spot, the canvas stopped at the inner dart. No need for it to go to the side seam. I cut the darts from the canvas and sewed a piece of scrap cotton fabric to the inside of one leg, then butted the other leg against the first and sewed it to the cotton scrap. I then felted the scrap down to keep the whole thing flat. I again hand sewed the front darts of the self fabric from the center outward. I snipped the center of the dart right to the stitch line. Oh yeah, lint control was a huge part of this project, and I kept getting black wool caught under my fingernails, so it looks like I was out gardening. Try not to notice it, it's wool, I promise. I matched the canvas to the front panels of the self. The neck and arm edges of the canvas had seam allowance, which I basted to the self. The other edges were net, so I catch-stitched them to the edge of the seam allowance of the self. This coat did not need quite as much structure as a Victorian jacket or bodice, but I did find the construction of the inner bits to be a good outlet for my inner control freak. The front also gets a shoulder support cut on the bias from the canvas. This should have been sewn to the main canvas piece before it was attached to the self. Oh well, I was careful to only sew through the canvas. I stitched a cotton twill tape along the front edge of the panel. I basted the darts to the canvas to keep them supported. No inverted darts here. I cut a backstay from a scrap of cotton. I stitched together the back seam of the stay. I pinked the bottom of the stay to keep it from fraying, even though it was eventually covered by the lining. I matched the two back panels of the coat right sides together. I happily stitched these together with my newly revamped industrial machine. I matched the stay to the wrong side of the back panel and basted it to the self around the seam allowance. I matched the shoulder seams of the front and back panels right sides together. I laid a piece of cotton twill tape along the shoulder seam on the wrong side of the front panel, and stitched through all layers. I laid the center front facing along the same cotton scrap as the back stay and basted around the perimeter. I matched the shoulders of the two center front facings to the shoulders of the back neck facing, right sides together, stitched and pressed. I matched the upper collar to the back neck facing along the neck edge, right sides together, and stitched it in place. I matched the under collar to the neck edge of the self, right sides together, and stitched it in place. I trimmed many notches from the resulting curved seams and pressed the seams open. I matched the outer edges of the upper and under collar and continued matching the front facing to the center front edge of the coat, right sides together. I sewed this as one long seam. Many more relief notches later, I basted all the seam allowances down to keep everything, you get it by now, flat. I turned the whole thing right side out and pressed the edges. I prick stitched along the edges to keep the edges crisp. I matched the side panel to the corresponding front and back side seams and pinned to the back vents. I sewed the 4 side seams and clipped the corners of the vents. I folded the vent corners inwards and pressed the vents into place. Just a quick moment for the sleeves. The 1890s is pretty notorious for having big sleeves, but the sleeves weren't just big. There were subtle differences between the early part of the decade, the middle part of the decade, and the later part of the decade. And big sleeves actually lasted into the Edwardian period as well. There's like nuance in there somewhere. As you could probably have guessed by now, this kind of connects to the shirtwaist dress that I made last month, and that was based on a 1980s Laura Ashley pattern. So I've been kind of exploring this 1890s, 1980s big sleeve paradox. I think the 1980s are actually more similar to the early 1890s. This is the Delineator magazine, which was a super popular fashion magazine in the Victorian/Edwardian period. And this is from March 1891. And you can kind of see how these sleeves are just sort of peaked at the cap and not really that full mid-1890s sleeve. I kind of feel like this is like the underrepresented portion of 1890s big sleeves. Everyone is in love with the super round ones, but you know, this was cool too. This is actually similar to this pattern, which is from the Edwardian drafting manual that I'm using. You can see that it has this sort of modestly large sleeve cap. I say modestly large, this is a huge sleeve cap. Same as the pattern, I'll just print this out, and I don't think I'm going to have to really change this all that much. It works pretty well. I cut the upper and lower sleeve pieces from the self. The sleeve was too narrow for my sleeve board, so I improvised. Again, heavy wool, the sleeves needed some help to reach their poof potential. I cut a piece of canvas in the shape of the sleeve cap with the horsehair vertical to really get the peak of the sleeve to stand up. Sleeves that are this voluminous in the cap can either be gathered or pleated into the armhole. I prefer gathers, but even the longest stitch on my machine didn't do much to gather the thick wool, so I ran a thick silk gathering thread by hand. I inserted the sleeve into the armhole with the body of the coat inside out and the sleeve inside the coat right sides together. I basted the sleeve in place. Once I knew the sleeve fit properly, I sewed it in permanently on the machine. To create the hem, I first pressed a 1-inch seam allowance to the wrong side. I trimmed away the width of the facing minus a 1-inch seam allowance from the center front and facing hem seam allowance. That's a mouthful. I then stitched a 1-inch strip of bias cut canvas to the inside just above the fold line of the hem and the back vents. I basted the hem seam allowance over the canvas strip. I laid the facing in place and whip-stitched the hem of the facing to the hem of the self. I fell-stitched the raw edge at the very bottom of the facing to the upturned seam allowance of the self hem. Technically, a tiny bit of this will be accessible to the inside of the coat if you were to lift up the lining, but this wool does not fray, so it's all above board. I created a similar hem on the sleeves. I catch-stitched the raw edge of the front facing to the inner canvas to keep it in place. I used a very lightweight black silk twill for the lining. I had to do some piecing on the sleeves, but otherwise the lining came together much the same as the body of the coat, minus the facings and all of the tailoring, of course. I absolutely could have put the coat and lining together right sides together and machine sewed around the edges, flipped it right side out and called it a day, but the Victorians would have likely lined it right sides out, sewing along the right side of the lining by hand, and most couture and bespoke pieces are still made this way. I flipped the lining inside out and stuffed it into the coat, wrong sides together. I very carefully matched up all the edges. There was a little unlined slit at the back neck facing edge, but that was intentional. I turned the lining seam allowance to the inside and stitched the lining to the hem first with a fell stitch. If it looks like the lining is too long for where I'm stitching it here, that is because it gets folded at the hem to create ease in the lining so that it won't rip out when you hunch or sit or anything. I stitched the inner edge of the vent lining right to the edge of the self, and the outer edge of the vent had its own cut as one facing, which I stitched down over the lining. I stitched together the lining at the top of the vent to enclose the area. I stitched the lining to the front facing and to the sleeve hems. I used a contrasting ivory grosgrain ribbon to attach the lining to the bottom edge of the back neck facing. I finally retaught myself how to hand sew buttonholes. It's not that hard, just something you have to practice at to get the stitches to be even. I'll link a video below that goes into way more detail about it, but if you are on this channel, you have probably already seen that video. I couldn't find any buttons I liked, so I made my own by enameling a bit of shell and drilling 2 holes. Perhaps that process can be its own video someday. Hello, good morning, or whatever time it is wherever you all are. Here it is first thing in the morning because I woke up this morning thinking about collars. Apparently this news needs to be shared first thing in the morning. So Bella's collars, she has a top collar and then a sort of under collar underneath it. And they have what looks like a lot of soutache work or cording on them because I want to give this thing the best possible chance of me actually wearing it IRL. And I think that all of the trimming may make it a little bit over the top for my wardrobe. But the under collar is pretty important to the overall look, so I definitely want to do that, but I want to do it my own way. Here is the early morning light that I've complained about in the past. This was actually my mom's pattern and, well, my pattern when I was much younger. I think that any 80s baby, 90s baby, whatever, probably was dressed in something like this at one point. And they've got these amazing sort of collars on them. It's like a sort of like a sailor's collar, I guess. So definitely want to have something like this on mine. But obviously this pattern is going to be a lot smaller than what I need. So I'm going to have to upgrade it a little bit, which means I'm going to have to sort through my mom's pattern organization method, which is less than ideal, but you know, she had her strengths and weaknesses. I traced the child's pattern onto pattern paper and draped it onto the coat. I added and subtracted paper until I had a shape that worked. I cut the pattern from the wool. I cut the back flap of the pattern from the silk, but the 2 front legs from the wool, since the underside will potentially show. I matched the top and underside of the collar right sides together. Victorian method, Schmishmorian method. I sewed the top and bottom together on the machine except for the edge at the bottom of the back flap. I used the resulting hole to turn the collar right side out and press the edges. That was a lot easier. I basted along the bottom of the open back flap edge. I turned up the bottom edge seam allowance and basted it into place. I covered the raw edge with another piece of ivory grosgrain ribbon. I made a huge bow with 2 wool scrap strips by turning the raw edges under and hem stitching. This created an awkwardly round, stiff hem, but actually worked perfectly for the purpose. I crossed the 2 strips in a bow-ish configuration and held it in place with another smaller strip. I tacked everything in place, then tacked the bow to the front of the collar to connect everything. Okay, bear with me for a moment because this is not the wrap-up that I thought I would be writing when I started this project. I think I resonate with Bella's story because, like her, I feel like I'm learning to operate within a system that doesn't have my best interests at heart all the time. Society is set up to homogenize people, and it only seems to care about our character arc in as far as that arc can be capitalized. I have no desire to design things that can be mass manufactured. For me, fashion has to and should mean something deeper than the data held in a SKU. That is sort of the thesis for this channel I've been pondering for a while. Anyway, I still have a lot to unpack here, obviously, and diving into Bella's character was an unexpectedly efficient way to get started. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and if you fancy further forays into character and history that drift into unexpected territory, hit subscribe. More Bella exploration to come, and some really exciting historical recreation on the horizon. Bye!